The moment the deadline passed, everything collapsed, not loudly, not publicly, but in that quiet, suffocating way where doors don't slam, they simply never open again. And somewhere deep inside the walls of Buckingham Palace, a decision had already been made long before anyone outside even realized there was a clock ticking. Harry missed it, not by accident, not by confusion. He missed it because he believed, or maybe convinced himself, that the rules didn't fully apply to him anymore, that there would always be one last extension, one final exception, one emotional override that would bend the system back in his favor. But this time there wasn't. By the time he landed back in Britain, carrying what insiders describe as a final appeal wrapped in desperation, the deadline had already expired, and the silence he walked into wasn't confusion. It wasn't hesitation. It was something far colder. It was finality. According to internal whispers that have begun leaking out in fragments, the ultimatum had been set days earlier by King Charles III, not as a dramatic confrontation, but as a quiet, structured condition buried inside a private conversation that very few people were ever meant to know about. A deadline with terms that were described as non-negotiable, non-extendable, and deeply personal. And Harry didn't meet them. What makes this more explosive isn't just that he failed, it's that the palace had already prepared for that outcome. Backup plans had been drafted. Financial contingencies had been quietly outlined. Emergency support structures had been discussed behind closed doors, not as a promise, but as a possibility, until the moment the deadline passed. Because the second that clock ran out, everything changed. Those backup plans, gone. Those contingency discussions, erased. That invisible safety net Harry thought still existed, pulled away completely. And the decision wasn't emotional. That's the part people are struggling to understand. It wasn't a father reacting in anger, it was a monarch executing a boundary that had been building for years. Years of repeated cycles, repeated promises, repeated breakdowns that had slowly reshaped how the institution itself viewed the situation. Inside that 45-minute meeting at Clarence House, the one that sources now describe as eerily calm, almost procedural, Harry didn't walk into a negotiation. He walked into a conclusion. The list he carried with him, a detailed breakdown of financial damage, obligations, and collapsing ventures, wasn't shocking to them. They had already seen it, already analyzed it, already calculated what it meant, not just for him, but for the institution. And the answer had already been written before he even sat down. There was no hesitation in that response, no softening, no attempt to cushion the blow, just a statement that cut through everything Harry had brought with him, not just the numbers, but the expectation behind them. The royal family is not a rescue system. And in that moment, something shifted permanently. Because Harry didn't just hear rejection, he realized the deadline wasn't about money at all. It never was. The financial crisis, the mounting pressure, the collapsing deals, those were symptoms. The real condition had been something deeper, something structural, something the palace had been waiting to see if he would ever meet, and he didn't. His response came fast, almost instinctive, not as a calculated argument, but as something more raw, more personal, more urgent. It wasn't about the numbers anymore. It was about survival, about trying to reframe the situation from institutional rules to human connection, from protocol to family. But that shift didn't land the way he needed it to. Because the reply he received didn't reject him, it rejected the idea that this could still be fixed the way it had been before. And that sentence, simple, controlled, almost painfully restrained, carried more weight than anything else said in that room. Because it wasn't just about refusing help. It was about acknowledging a pattern that had reached its breaking point. Harry left that meeting with exactly what he walked in with. Nothing changed. But outside that room, something much bigger had already been set in motion. Within hours, a closed-door advisory session was called at Buckingham Palace, not to debate the decision, but to formalize it. 12 senior figures, legal advisors, institutional strategists, all brought together under a rule that had been quietly established years earlier by Queen Elizabeth II for moments exactly like this. Moments where personal emotion could no longer guide the outcome. And what they produced wasn't a reaction. It was a verdict, unanimous, immediate, final. That line, buried in the middle of a much longer internal discussion, became the core of everything, because it exposed the one weakness that made Harry's entire offer collapse before it could even be considered. Control. Not financial control, not strategic control, but something far more unpredictable, control over what happens next, over what is said, what is revealed, what is escalated. And according to that room, he didn't have it, which meant the promise he brought with him, the one thing he thought might reopen the door, had no real weight behind it. And once that was understood, the rest of the decision became almost automatic. By the time the meeting ended, the outcome was no longer longer personal. It was institutional, locked, documented, unchangeable. Harry hadn't just missed a deadline, he had missed the last moment where the situation could still be reversed. And as he stepped out of that world and prepared to return to a life that was already starting to fracture under pressure, another storm was quietly building. One that would explode less than 24 hours later and confirm everything the palace had just decided. But that part didn't come from inside the palace. It came from somewhere much closer. And just when it seemed like the situation could not tighten any further, something surfaced that didn't just add pressure, it exposed everything the palace had already concluded, but this time in full public view, raw and undeniable, with no need for interpretation, no need for insiders, no need for whispers behind closed doors, because suddenly the evidence was everywhere, spreading faster than anyone could contain it, and it didn't come from an official statement or a royal leak. It came from something far more uncontrollable: visibility. Images, circulating quietly at first, then exploding across social platforms within hours, photographs from a book signing event weeks earlier, images that should have been harmless, routine, forgettable, except they weren't, because written inside those books, clear as day, was a signature that should not have existed anymore. A title that had already been stripped away years ago, a line that instantly triggered every protocol alarm inside the palace: Meghan. And in that moment, everything the advisory board had debated the day before suddenly became real, because the entire argument, the one that decided Harry's fate, had revolved around one critical question: could he guarantee control over what happens next? And now, less than a day after that unanimous decision, the answer was staring the world in the face. No, that response didn't feel like damage control. It felt like confirmation, like the palace wasn't surprised, just prepared, because what had happened overnight wasn't just a minor breach of protocol, it was a direct contradiction of the very conditions that had defined the Sussex exit years earlier. A condition that had been clear, documented, legally understood: no use of her in any public or commercial context. And yet here it was, written casually, deliberately, permanently, in ink. Within hours, a formal notice followed, not as a warning, not as a suggestion, but as a demand, precise, structured, and impossible to ignore. But what happened next is where the situation took a turn that even insiders didn't fully anticipate. Because instead of correction, instead of acknowledgement, instead of even a subtle attempt to de-escalate, there was silence, followed by something even more provocative: a brief, almost defiant, social media post that appeared, lingered just long enough to be captured, and then vanished as if it had never been meant to stay, but absolutely meant to be seen. No apology, no clarification, no retreat. And just like that, the palace didn't need to argue its position anymore. It had proof. What had been decided behind closed doors now had a public example attached to it. Something tangible, something immediate, something that turned a theoretical concern into a visible pattern unfolding in real time. And back in California, inside a house already carrying the weight of financial collapse, that moment didn't pass quietly. Because when Harry landed, not on a private jet this time, not with the same confidence he left with, but returning with nothing resolved, nothing secured, nothing changed, he didn't just walk into a problem. He walked into a confrontation. Not explosive at first, not loud, but heavy, layered, inevitable. The kind of confrontation that builds not from a single moment, but from weeks of pressure, misaligned decisions, reverse strategies, and a growing realization that everything they thought they could control was slipping. Because this wasn't just about the palace anymore. It was about what happens when the strategy itself begins to collapse. Harry believed the trip had to happen, that even a slim chance of intervention was worth the risk, that doing nothing would have been worse than trying and failing. But from the other side, that same decision looked completely different. It looked like weakness. And that word, simple, cutting, loaded, didn't just land in that moment. It echoed back through everything that had led up to it. Every choice, every escalation, every time pressure had been applied to the royal family as leverage, every assumption that the institution would eventually bend rather than break. Because now it was clear, it wasn't bending. And more than that, it had stopped engaging entirely. That's the part that changed everything. Not the rejection itself, but the absence of negotiation afterward. No follow-up channels, no quiet backdoor discussions, no softened conditions, no delayed reconsideration, just silence. And that silence forced something neither of them had fully faced before. Without the palace as the central opponent, without that constant push and pull dynamic that had defined their entire post-royal narrative, there was nothing left to absorb the pressure, which meant the pressure turned inward. Every financial strain became more visible. Every failed deal became harder to ignore. more. Every strategic disagreement became sharper, more personal, more immediate, because now there was no external force to blame in real time, only each other. And the numbers weren't abstract anymore. They were real, immediate, compounding in ways that made every decision heavier than the last. Debt feeding into legal exposure feeding into cash flow issues feeding into asset decisions that once would have been unthinkable, but were now being quietly discussed behind closed doors. Not publicly confirmed, not officially announced, but happening. Because when the safety net disappears, the choices change. What insiders describe as liquidation conversations weren't dramatic fire sales, not yet, but they were the kind of quiet evaluations that happen when maintaining a lifestyle begins to conflict with sustaining reality. What can be kept? What can be let go? What can be restructured? What can be delayed? And for the first time, those questions weren't hypothetical. They were urgent. Meanwhile, back in Britain, the institution continued exactly as it always does. Steady, unmoved, almost untouched by the turbulence happening outside its walls. Engagements continued. Appearances proceeded. The structure held. Because that's what it was designed to do. Not react. Endure. And that contrast between a system built for continuity and a situation spiraling under its own weight made the divide feel even sharper, even more irreversible. Harry's missed deadline wasn't just a moment. It was a pivot, a point where everything that could have gone one way went the other, where every remaining option narrowed, every remaining path became steeper, every remaining decision carried consequences that could no longer be delayed. And now, standing at the edge of that shift, the question isn't whether the palace will reconsider. It won't. The question is whether Harry will, because the condition that was set before that deadline hasn't changed. It's still there, unmoved, unextended, waiting. And the longer it remains unmet, the more everything else around him continues to unravel, piece by piece, quietly, steadily, until there's nothing left to negotiate with at all.